Raheem, the Hall of Fame ballot is among us. I have here my Hall of Fame ballot from the International Boxing Hall of Fame in Canastota, upstate New York. I have casted three of my ballots that we will get to, but what seems to be the main topic of discussion right now is one Gennadyevich Golovkin, Triple G. There's seems to be two trains of thought. You're an absolute imbecile if you don't think he's a bona fide first ballot Hall of Famer. And then there's the opposing train of thought that Golovkin's this great white hype, great white hope, HBO manufactured great fighter, overrated, and that kind of thing. And like I usually do, I don't really align with either sentiment. I think the truth is somewhere in the middle. I do think, for starters, there's no debate that Golovkin is a Hall of Famer. He's definitely a top 10 middleweight all time in my eyes, and arguably top five. I don't think there's any way you could put him ahead of Hopkins, Hagler, Robinson, or Monzon, and I'll get to why as we discuss this. But after those four, I mean, you could even argue him in top five at number five. But we'll get to all of it shortly. My contention is he absolutely a first ballot Hall of Famer when there's been some great fighters in the history of the sport who've had to wait over a decade to get their nomination, who are just as accomplished or more accomplished than Golovkin? But I'll let you start, Raheem.
Well, the first ballot question is an interesting one because timing is everything, right? I I say Golovkin goes in. However, my criteria for why he goes in and on the first ballot may greatly differ from those who claim you're an imbecile if you think he doesn't go in at all. I believe boxing owes, at the very least, Triple G a first ballot Hall of Fame uh, reward, if you will, for him having suffered and been disillusioned by the business of boxing. I think boxing did Triple G dirty. And because of that, and of course, his knockout ratio, his stand at 160 pound, his title defense, consecutive title defenses, one short, I believe, than he deserves. Maybe even two, but definitely one short of what he deserves. And in fact, the way that he had to swallow that incredibly bitter pill and continue on in his career after having been, I think, wrongly stripped of his title against Canelo Alvarez in their first fight. I mean, for me, it's not an argument. He clearly won that first fight, which absolutely changed the trajectory of his entire career. And in that moment, if nothing else, because I think, and this is what I will always remind you, that Manuel Marquez told me before Pacquiao 4, he stole my life. When I look at Canelo, I think, man, this guy stole Triple G's life. And because of that alone, at the tail end of the other accolades that I mentioned, go in as a first ballot because we owe you that, because we don't know what you might have done had boxing not done you dirty.
Well, to push back on that for a moment, that he should have beaten Canelo, because I see that being argued for him as why he is first ballot. If you try to punch holes in his resume, and you could do that with almost any fighter, his best win is Daniel Jacobs, Derevianchenko, and Kell Brook, right? Those are probably his three best wins. And if you say, well, he should have beaten Canelo, well, I got on this Hall of Fame ballot Meldrick Taylor, who knocked out a current Hall of Famer in Buddy McGirt. Buddy McGirt made the Hall of Fame, and he knocked him out, and he should have beaten Julio Cesar Chavez. And yet here he still is on the outside looking in for more than 20 years. And also, and I'm not saying Meldrick should get in, because I understand he lost a lot of fights after his career. He never grabbed multiple belts in a weight class like Golovkin did. But there's that. I mean, Sergey Kovalev, if he's on the ballot, does he get to get in because he should have beaten Andre Ward in the first fight? I don't know if people are making that argument for him. And no,
I'm
well,
not.
we could disagree. We could disagree there, right? But and then even in that first Canelo fight, which we both covered, I thought live 116, 112 Golovkin. He to say he did no worse than a draw would probably be generous to Canelo. But I will say, when I rewatched that fight multiple times on television, Canelo was able to be slick enough defensively, didn't control the center of the ring. He was backed up from pillar to post in that fight for much of that fight. But Golovkin, fighting him at 35, it was hard because Canelo didn't really fight a prime Triple G in my eyes. At least not a peak Triple G. But Golovkin at 35, slowing down a little bit, couldn't really consistently find Canelo with power shots. And Canelo was able to find him with sporadic power shots in that first fight. And defensively, outside of the jab and the constant pressure, he wasn't able to land clean on Canelo a whole lot in that first fight. But that being said, he probably deserved to win it. And I want to say this for Golovkin, when you talk about how he did dirty. He had a unification with Dmitry Pirog, who knocked out Jacobs lined up. Pirog had to retire because his back betrayed him. Miguel Cotto clearly ducked him. Sergio Maravilla Martinez clearly ducked him, in my opinion. Canelo Alvarez had his belt and then vacated it and then fought him 2 years later, aged him out a little bit. I'll acknowledge all of that, and I'll acknowledge that if Golovkin got those deserved opportunities, then I wouldn't be having this discussion about his resume. He'd have a couple of huge names on his resume that I think. And then eye test-wise, Golovkin has one of the great jabs in middleweight history. He's one of the great punchers in boxing history. He tucked his chin beautifully. He may not have been a guy with a ton of reflexes and a ton of defensive maneuvers, but he's one of the best I've ever seen at tucking the chin, which is one of the fundamentals of defense. And yeah, one of the great punchers ever, all that stuff. So go ahead, Raheem.
The only exception I take is I thought he did find Canelo with power shots. He was backing Canelo up after the seventh. Canelo was gassed. I thought, really, to be fair to Canelo, he rolled some of those shots that might have looked bigger than what they were. But even in that, Triple G was winning the exchanges, winning the war of real estate. He won the fight. Like, he just won the fight. That aside, all the other things that you mentioned, who didn't fight him, and again, the accolades that he did acquire through the weight divisions, through his consecutive defenses, all of that stuff goes into the pot as to justify, career-wise, stats-wise, resume-wise, how you can make a case for him. The Mildred Taylor of it all is exactly what I meant by timing is everything. Is this a question we're asking because of what Triple G is now doing? I think, sadly, in the Hall of Fame discussion, not unlike the judging in boxing, where we just discovered yet another moment that has changed the trajectory of a fighter's life, it's all so subjective. There are no hard and fast guidelines or rules by which to determine these things. So it's going to also become incredibly political. What Triple G is now doing in his post-fight career might have something to do with why he's on the ballot right now and why they want him in as a first ballot Hall of Famer, because of his post-fight political positioning and his ambitions after his boxing career to be a part of the business of boxing. That has to be part of the discussion because everything in boxing has an element of politics. And yes, I think Mildred Taylor goes in. I think that the reason we're still not having a Mildred Taylor in the Hall of Fame probably has a lot to do with politics of boxing. And when, in fact, he gets in, will have a lot to do with when he's proposed to get in and who else is on the ballot that year and who else has momentum or backing behind them or who else is calling journalists on the behalf of the nominee and what it means for that person to go in at that time. Should all of that be a part of the decision-making of each person who gets a ballot? Absolutely not. But is it? I'm convinced that it is. I'm convinced that it is. This discussion has to come down to what your criteria is for putting somebody in the Hall of Fame. Is it the fights that he fought and won and the titles that he held and defended? Or is it the people who ducked him or the judges that robbed him or the time and the era in which he fought where maybe there wasn't competition enough to push him? These are the real questions. And then you have to put an accent of politics on the answer every time because it's always a play.
Yeah, I mean, there could very well be bias involved. Some of these people that I respect, our colleagues, have been very tight with Tom Loeffler. They've been tight with Triple G's camp for years. Last year, Sean's on the ballot, Sean Porter. I voted for Sean. Is Sean a first ballot Hall of Famer? No. I do think Sean, separate discussion, in an era where most fights weren't made in the best against the best, he was a guy who symbolized and stood for that virtue of still chasing the best. He crossed the street to fight Crawford on a Top Rank show when nobody was doing that from PBC, and separate discussion for another day. But I'm acknowledging I did it. I'm not going to vote for Sean this year, but so that's a real thing. And before we play our violins for Golovkin about the politics of boxing, there's a lot of fighters who'd probably say, I had a tougher resume, fought greater fighters and was in greater fights and made a lot less money and got a lot less dates from HBO and never got ranked #1 pound for pound like Golovkin did either. So the politics, and he did that Mexican style thing, which it had sincerity in it, but you could also argue was grifting a little bit off the Mexican fans. And then by the time he fought a true Mexican fighter who brought to him the Mexican style, which was Canelo. In the rematch, Canelo backed him up and beat him and took those middleweight titles from him. And I mentioned Kovalev with Ward in the first fight. Kovalev deserved to win that first fight. I'll never forget when Gennady made his HBO appearance, and he said, anyone from 154 to 168. And that raised Andre Ward's antennas. And he goes, you mean me too? Because we could do that. And I'd have to go down the rabbit hole of negotiations. I'm sure Golovkin's supporters could spin it that, no, Dre was just running his mouth. And if you're an Andre Ward supporter, you're going to say it was a blatant duck. Look, I believe Andre would have taken that fight if Golovkin really wanted, and I believe Andre would have won that fight. And it was Golovkin who opened up about 68. He ultimately didn't get to 68 until he fought Canelo in an anticlimactic, third fight, right? But yeah.
First of all, the rematch was a draw.
A lot of people feel that way, yeah.
So for me, if he wins the first fight on the cards, as he should have, and the second fight is a draw, and by the way, the second fight is my favorite Canelo fight. I still think it was a draw.
Me too.
If you said I could only watch one Canelo fight from now to the rest of my life, if I ever want to see Canelo fight again, it's Triple G 2.
He agrees with you. He says that was his finest hour too. Canelo, whenever he's asked what was his finest hour, he says it was that Triple G rematch. I agree.
Right. And I think the 68 discussion for Triple G was because he wasn't getting the fights that were going to be mega money at 60 and wasn't making his superstardom rocket, and he had already been done by the Canelo machine, and he was reaching for greatness. I would be picking Dre in that fight too, but I do believe that he sincerely was calling Andre out, and why the fight didn't happen probably has a bunch of answers. However, that again raises the question that I really pose is, what is the criteria? I mean, I'm assuming everyone that you ask will have a slightly different answer, but that's the true question. Is it the fights that you didn't have and why those fights don't happen as part of the equation? And if it is, then the fighters who go in, who maybe didn't take the fights that they could have taken, however, have a stacked resume, have a bunch of title defenses, have done things that are iconic in the sport, yet you can say, well, he should have fought this guy at this time. Well, he didn't take that fight. Well, he didn't get that fight. Are those detractions from whether or not they get in the Hall of Fame, or are we just looking at what you did? There are so many questions. And to be fair, I'll be honest with you. Yeah, and what did you say?
Eye test as well, because I think that's benefiting Golovkin in this assessment is the eye test. You know what your eyes saw. He was a great middleweight. And I think that's helping his cause a little bit is the eye test. But the eye test is subjective.
If he could have pursued his career at middleweight fairly, if he could have retained his titles and, Canelo get off where his stop really was, then we're looking at a whole different, we don't know. We're like, there's a whole different history painted if Triple G wins the first fight and the second fight's a draw. Maybe we do still get a third fight, but then we're getting a third fight immediately. And it's at 160. Who knows what happens then? You know what I'm saying? These are the things that just hurt my heart in boxing, because I truly believe that they've changed the lives of fighters unfairly. But with the Hall of Fame conversation, I'll be honest with you, I'm not a big Hall of Fame guy. I'm more here to talk about your criteria. First of all, they don't send me a ballot, maybe rightly so. So I am here to speak to those who are qualified to have an opinion, and that is everybody who has a ballot. I don't give a whole bunch of credence to it because I don't know what it means with anybody. It's called the Hall of Fame. So if your name is big enough, if you're famous enough, but your resume isn't really supportive of a great fighter or an all-time elite, but hey, if you're in the Hall of Fame because everyone will remember your name, or is it because everyone should remember your name, even if you never did get famous enough? Like, boxing has to decide how it decides things at some point. And until then, these debates will go on. But if there were one person with whom I could lay my pen and be like, you vote for me, it's Sean Zattel.
Well, for me, and I'll get to my criteria and why I got the three people, because I could have up to five and I will reach the five, but I want to pose it to the comments a little bit. Because I have until Halloween for this thing to get into the mail in upstate. So I got a week or two to deliberate. The real shame for me of Golovkin is a similar point to the one you've made. It's that guy who came on HBO for his first fight in 2012 against Proska. It's a Polish fighter, doesn't have a name. Forget who he was in the ring with. That, to me, was peak Golovkin. He was 30. We didn't get to see him until he was already 30 years old. We might, like, his real peak, most of it probably didn't even truly come on HBO. It probably came a half second before HBO and the first couple fights on HBO. By the time he was fighting Canelo in 2017, he's 35 years old. So the guy that I saw originally, Golovkin was never the fastest, twitchiest guy, but he was a lot more fluid and less stiff at 30 compared to 35. That guy was a bad motherfucker. That, I just want to give him that props. Like, I love that version of Golovkin, and the shame to me is that version never got to fight great fighters. So that sucks. But here's my pushback. One argument I see for Golovkin is the 20 title defenses. And I take that a little personally, with my favorite fighter of all time being Bernard Hopkins, who co-holds that record at 20. But here's the thing. Guys like Gervonta Davis, deservedly, they get raked for, you got a Mickey Mouse belt, you got a WBA interim or a WBA regular. Gennady Golovkin had a WBA regular belt for half of his title defenses. Bernard had the IBF title, the full, there was no interim back in 95 when he wins it against Segundo Mercado. Hopkins held a full title, and back when there was only 3 recognized. Golovkin held a smaller version of the WBA title when there's 4 titles recognized. It's not the same thing. And he had 4 defenses as the true unified middleweight champion of the world. Hopkins had 6 defenses as the true unified middleweight champion of the world, and he had 20 defenses of a full middleweight title. So it's not the same thing. Carlos Monzon had 14 defenses of the full middleweight title. Marvin Hagler had 12 defenses of the full middleweight title. Ray Robinson won the full middleweight title 5 times. That's why I definitely got to put all of those guys ahead of Golovkin first and foremost. After that, at number 5, I think of James Toney. James Toney knocked out Michael Nunn when he was number 1 pound for pound. But that brings me to a point. Michael Nunn was the 1988 Fighter of the Year. He was the recognized legitimate champion at middleweight and super middleweight. He was, when he got knocked out by James Toney, number 1 pound for pound. Michael Nunn had to wait almost 2 decades to get in the Hall of Fame. And I know he had some out of the ring troubles that had him in prison in the 90s and everything, but we're talking boxing, okay? He had to wait 20 years. Michael Moore just got in last year. Michael Moore, he may not have unified at light heavyweight, but he was good enough that Emmanuel Stewart called Michael Moore the greatest light heavyweight he had ever seen with his own 2 eyes. And Michael Moore is alongside only Roy Jones Jr. and Michael Spinks as the only fighters to go from light heavyweight to heavyweight and become champion. And those 2 are first ballot Hall of Famers. Michael Moore beat Evander Holyfield for the legitimate unified heavyweight championship of the world. Jim Lampley, I got his book upstairs. It's called It Happened. You know who it happened to? Michael Moore. And Max Kellerman, the great Max Kellerman, he made a point in why Triple G should get in as first ballot, that you can't tell the story of boxing without getting to Michael Moore, right? Or without getting to Triple G. Well, that's the case for Michael Moore. It didn't matter. On my ballot right here, 2 of my 3 votes are for Antonio Tarver and Fernando Vargas. 2 fighters that you cannot tell the history of boxing without mentioning them, okay? Antonio Tarver, when he knocked out, so Golovkin should get in first ballot because he maybe was number 1 pound for pound. Okay, Antonio Tarver, alongside Juan Manuel Marquez, knocking out Manny Pacquiao. Those 2 knockouts, knocking out Roy Jones and Marquez knocking out Pacquiao, stand alone, head and shoulders, as the 2 greatest knockouts in boxing since the new millennium, since the year 2000. for when he knocked out, even Roy Jones was forced to lean back, like Fat Joe said. Fat Joe saying that speaks to my point. When Tarver knocked out Roy, he shook up the sports world. Forget the boxing world. Roy Jones was Mr. Unstoppable, Mr. Pound for Pound for a decade. Antonio Tarver could be 1-6. If that's his one win as a professional, he's a Hall of Famer, and he's still not in. And I know he popped for steroids. Go ahead, Raheem.
Well, one thing that must be mentioned is there are so few in boxing iconic one-liners. Like, you would think that
got any excuses tonight, Roy?
But that one goes into the annals of history and will always be remembered in the sport of boxing. What a time to say that. What a moment to have that kind of confidence and a surety in the face of arguably, but on my record, maybe the best, if not the greatest, the best to ever do it, right before you knock him out again? Like,
Cold
listen.
In the second round? Well, not Cold. Listen, he got up by the 10th count. He did, but
you know, they're just a handful of sayings. There's just a handful of sayings that happened in boxing that will be remembered forever until this day. That is one of them. The question, though, well, and by the way, I don't know if because there may be some audio, like people out there, I want to apologize because your audio might be a little fuzzy. It sounds like a sizzling. That is not an audio. That's Sean cooking. Yeah. That high-pitched sizzle you heard was Sean Zettel chefing for all of us. It is
just confused with whining sometimes. I understand.
Favorite dish. Like that, what you just seen was prime Zettel right there. This really doesn't get better than that. And what occurred to me while you were speaking, and really, I couldn't wait to ask because it has everything to do with all the things that you said. You got so animated as you broke down these fighters' careers and who was in already and whether or not Triple G should be a first ballot Hall of Famer considering the bar. But we always think of how high the bar is. But at the same time, where is the bottom bar? Like the guy who's in that so many people have a better case than. So is that where we said that, like, if this guy is in, and I don't want to, I'm not trying to diss anybody or disrespect Vinny Paz or, you know what I mean? It could be your story. Could it be your story? Could it be the kind of guy you were outside the ring? Could it be one single fight where you dethroned the king and really didn't have a career to speak of outside that moment? But, you Hasim Rahman, you know what I mean? Could that be enough to get you into the Hall of Fame? And again, I don't want anyone to feel as if this is a disrespect of them or a diss of what they've done. What I'm saying is you can do one thing or you can have something that is so great that maybe the rest of your career you would have a hard time making a case for you to get into the Hall of Fame if you didn't do that one great thing. But then is that where the bar is? You just have to do that one great thing and then have a pretty good career to surround it. We can't measure it against who's in or who got in first ballot or because if we do, then if you go through, and I haven't, but if you go through a magnifying glass, I'm sure you can find that one guy where everybody's like, what? And if that's the bar you have to clear, then they need to give you 15 picks a year.
Right.
Right.
And Tarver, since it's called the Hall of Fame, he starred as an antagonist opposite Rocky Balboa in a movie. It's kind of famous.
And he's managed to stay relevant. He's
commentating the fights right now. He was there in New York City in May.
He's the best one commentating on those cards for that's the one I most enjoy at this point listening to. Not something I would have anticipated, but whenever I interview Tarver, he's dialed in. It's a fun time. We get views. It's, you know what I mean? He stayed energetic in that moment, like we just spoke about. Will never be forgotten. Will never be forgotten.
And he's not in the Hall of Fame. Still not. Okay, all right. So he popped for a PED when he became a heavyweight. Still? All right, fine. He doesn't get,
But that is my question. Does that a detraction then? Do we say, okay, here's all the great things, and then here's the things that we subtract from the great things? Or is it just a bar that we set by the great things? You know what I mean? Like... So really the question really is to you, Sean, because you're the one with the ballot in this conversation. Max's ballot looks different than yours, maybe, but he's got his own criteria, and nobody can say his criteria is wrong and yours is right. We can
Right.
only
It's a
agree or
matter of opinion.
disagree. And I think that that is actually a part of a problem in boxing. I really wish that we could decide how we decide things. And let me just wind you up for a second while I got the mic. Will Zufa fighters be eligible for the Boxing Hall of Fame if they're only ever fighting for the Zufa title? 15 years from now, will we have to look back on Zufa careers and decide whether or not they qualify for this accolade?
They'll be fine because if Zufa proliferates and has success in boxing, the political connection will be there that you touched on earlier in this video. You know what I mean? Uh, and a lot of the boxing establishment seems to be supporting Zufa's eventual venture into boxing in 2026. So I think they'll be on. They'll be fine if their fighters perform well, and if they produce great fighters. Yeah, I think they'll get in the Hall of Fame. A lot of what ifs got to play out. If they become a big, the big dance in town that they want to be, and
But should they? Let's say that this legislation passes and they have their own entity, they have their own belt, they don't fight outside of Zufa, and fighters only fight in there unless and until they graduate to ring, which is what we, I guess, expect will happen, and then they have a career beyond Zufa. But then they're never fighting for these sanctioning body belts. They don't have to deal with the outside ranking system. Let's hope that those systems stay relevant while Zufa is also successful. How do we decide one guy's career of 12 years fighting only Zufa fighters as another guy who fights outside of that system and has to collect belts and deal with mandatories and deal with sanctioning bodies and all that? Is that an even playing field? Do we decide that now? Or do, like you say, we just wait for the politics to make themselves known, and then we always know that you just follow the money on that, and there's no question that Zufa will be measured up against everybody else and potentially be in the Hall of Fame without having an even playing field with the other people that have to qualify for it. These kind of changes, like I say about what might happen with the offensive-minded nature of, I think, Dana White's, oh fuck moments and want to create, especially early, going to want to create a different kind of consistency of entertainment in boxing, which I think can only legislate by changing the rules. So these kind of questions, I don't know that everybody is ready to wrestle with, but they will come up. They will come up. And
I think the best I could answer that for me personally is to just deal with things with intellectual honesty and not be intellectually dishonest. If Zufa turns out to have most of the best welterweights, middleweights, and said welterweight beats most of those best welterweights in the world, middleweights in the world under the Zufa brand, we just got to have enough intellectual honesty to admit, hey, Zufa did have most of the top 10 guys in this weight class. You know what I mean? It just requires a level of intellectual honesty that I believe I'm capable of. So I can only speak for what I'll do if and maybe when that comes to pass. But I do want to go back to why my reasoning for why I have. So Fernando Vargas up until Canelo was the youngest junior middleweight champion in the sport's history. And he beat a damn good fighter to do it in Yuri Boy Campus. What gets Vargas over the line for me, and again, you can't tell the history of boxing without El Feroz. He's the second most famous Chicano fighter that ever lived behind Oscar. And their fight was a seminal moment, like in Chicano culture. I remember I was invited to the company barbecue with my friend, and him and his sister, both Mexican. They were on opposite. I remember the line from his sister Cynthia was, "Yeah, Vargas is fine, but I want Oscar to win." Like, that's how into it everybody was. But anyways, beyond that stuff, Vargas beat Winky Wright. Winky Wright's a bona fide Hall of Famer. He's in the Hall of Fame. Winky Wright was number 2 pound for pound. Winky Wright is one of the greatest fighters that ever lived in the 154-pound division. Vargas beat him in one of the more underrated fight scraps you'll see. That was a hell of a fight. Very close and competitive, but Vargas pulled it out. Iquarte, Javier Castillejo is a more accomplished super welterweight middleweight than just about anybody on Golovkin's resume. And he was in some of the greatest fights in the sport's history. His fight with Felix Trinidad, 6 knockdowns. He fought Trinidad. He fought the best version of Trinidad that ever lived. He fought a better version of Trinidad than Oscar did. He got him at the sweet spot, 154, where he wasn't killing himself to make 47 no more, was a grizzled veteran, having fought the best of the best in his run at 47, but still was on the light side of 30. and they had 6 knockdowns. They don't get better than Trinidad Vargas. There's been fights as good as Trinidad Vargas, but they don't get any better. And so
Agreed.
Fernando Vargas gets my vote. And then lastly, this one hits home for me for my point. Israel Magnifico Vasquez, okay? Israel Vasquez lost his life earlier this year. You talk about leaving it all in the ring. He left it all in the ring, man. He couldn't see out of one eye, I believe, for much of the late part of his life. His health had deteriorated to where you couldn't even recognize him by the time he died young. This man, he beat greater fighters and was in greater fights than a Gennady Golovkin. And in death, he's still not in the Hall of Fame. He is one of the greatest 122 pounders that ever lived. He won a trilogy and they had one extra fight that was unnecessary, but he won trilogies against guys that were on the pound for pound list. This Oscar Chololo Larios is the fighter that Canelo looked up to the most in the gym. He was Chepo Reynoso's first guy before Canelo, and Chololo Larios was a top champion at 22. He was so good that he went 12 rounds in Manila with a prime Pacquiao, and Vasquez, right before that fight with Pacquiao, took him out in 3 rounds. Vasquez, he had this come from behind knockout on Johnny Gonzalez. You remember Johnny Gonzalez, Raheem?
Of course.
Dude was on the pound for pound list. He was elite. He was so good that when he was washed, he knocked out Abner Mares in 1 round, who was a pound for pounder on a Hall of Fame caliber run himself at that time, grabbing belts at 18, 22, 26. Johnny knocked him out in 1 round, and Abner was never the same. And that was a washed version. That Johnny in his prime got knocked out by Israel in one of the all-time come-from-behind knockout victories in boxing history. The only other 2 that come to my mind is Jake LaMotta against Tatil and Antonio DeMarco against Jorge Linares in a fight you covered at Staples Center. So here's Vasquez, who won a fight of the year in a trilogy. That trilogy was so good, Stallone and Nicholson were ringside to watch the 3rd fight. He won it by a dramatic 12th round knockdown he needed to have to win that trilogy. That's my point. So Israel Vasquez, who gave everything to this sport, who beat greater fighters that were on the pound for pound list than Golovkin did, was in greater fights than Golovkin. He's not in. So why is everybody clutching their pearls that it's such a travesty if Golovkin doesn't get in first ballot? I just named a whole bunch of guys who've been waiting over a decade to get in. Not Vasquez been waiting half a decade, but
the fights that you mentioned, I remember them all. It was ringside for most. That isn't even what would sway me. I wouldn't even be thinking about that if I receive a ballot that says Israel Vasquez on it. What I would be thinking about is the guy I encountered at Wild Card Boxing Gym before all of those fights happened. The man that I got to know, the incredible human being that he was throughout every one of those trials of will and every one of those brutal battles of resilience, and including the fight for his life at the end. This was one of the best people I've ever known in the sport of boxing. I was there for that entire ride. I was there for moments I sadly won't even remember because I've seen him spar so much, seen him on the pad so often, had so many conversations in the locker room, just shooting the shit because I've seen him at so many events and dinners and award shows and ringside that I couldn't even hesitate to mark that name for the Hall of Fame any chance that you give me. Now, is that politics? Should I simply remove all of that from the equation and look at all the things that you just broke down, which I wholly agree is enough? But really, would that be what I'm betting on, what you said? No. You marked Sean Porter's name because of your relationship with Sean Porter. Do you not have that right? Is that some kind of failure of your duty? No, this is what I mean. Politics creeps in. None of us are completely immune from it. Nobody has to pay me to put Vasquez in or pay you to mark Sean 1 year and not the next. Because if he was good enough last year, he's still got to be good enough this year.
I'm on my high horse this year, so he has to wait until next year.
You see what I mean? Like no one's talking about Israel though. I mean, the way that his life ended in his final battle, and the tragic appearance
Mhm.
that you would have to stomach, especially if you knew the guy the way I did for as long as I did. It's a very difficult thing to look at. It's enough, man. It's enough to give him that accolade. But it is timing. It is fame. They do call it the Hall of Fame, also for a reason. Even boxing writers and those of us who come to the sport are influenced by fame and influence on the sport and the culture and what fighters had the biggest fights, if not the best fights. What fighters have the resumes you remember because they were on the platforms or at the weights that were celebrated, as opposed to maybe who had the best fights that are the most memorable if you saw them. The I would like to at least be able to hold ourselves accountable for where the bottom of the bar is, where the top of the line is, and then what are the exceptions to the rule, right? This is all I ask. Justify for me your picks against the ones whose boxes you don't check year to year. I don't know that anybody is giving a better breakdown of a fighter's career than you are for each one of your picks. So the only thing that's left for me to do is to just talk about the other side of it, which is the politics of it or the personal investment in it. Like the Antonio Tarvers of it all. Yeah, that iconic moment and that quote in that big fight twice, really. Those two massive fights where he shocked the world. Even the second time, we was like, there's no if you even if you thought he was gonna win it, it was like that. And then after saying that, like he created a moment. These these are the intangibles that not every fighter is going to have, but arguably could have just that and supersede a whole career of justification if you simply remember them enough to where they will be in the Hall of Fame because they will always be famous for those moments.
Yeah, and here's the funny thing is I mean even Jorge Arce's on this ballot. Him and Eric Morales and Canelo are still the only four division champions from Mexico, I believe. And the dude was in bloody wars, war after war. So he's still waiting to get in. And that's why I just wonder, is Golovkin first ballot? There's no doubt that he's a Hall of Famer, and I'm leaning towards yes, but I have a twist of irony for everybody. I'm being a little bit of a wise ass with this. But do you recall earlier in the year, I said I felt like there was just a touch too much hoopla surrounding Chris Eubank Jr. and Conor Benn, right? I said at the end of the day, okay, both. So let me get this straight. I have to be as over the moon about this fight because they're fathers, right? Their fathers are iconic and essential to the sport in the United Kingdom, right? And the fact that their sons are meeting in the ring, who cares that it's not for a title? It means a lot, right? Then why aren't they in the Hall of Fame? Then why
I knew
have
this was
both of them
coming.
stopped fighting
I
since
knew
the
this was coming.
1990s?
I knew this was coming. And the reason is because of politics, Sean. The reason is because they didn't make that impact globally. It is a fight that no British boxing fan, their son or grandfather alike, don't have an opinion on. But outside of this United Kingdom, nobody knows what the fuck you are talking about, which is why you were not nearly as excited about that fight, whereas I was, the energy was palpable for me. And of course, that first fight delivered would help a whole lot. But the reason is because the second fight is coming. It doesn't have nearly the same attention or attraction. It isn't having the hype. There isn't as much fervor for it. It's a little bit like diminishing returns. So let's put these guys in the Hall of Fame. Let's make that a part of this second fight narrative as well. Let's get that conversation going, which is not to say that they don't deserve to be in it. Again, I don't even get a ballot. So again, based on your criteria, but I believe that the reason that they're both on that sheet this year and the reason that they are probably being pushed is because it services a political need of the moment. It helps sell another fight that's coming. And it's a great discussion to have so that in a moment like this, you would never have otherwise had a reason to bring up Eubank Ben 2. But here we are talking about it.
Well, funny enough, to your point about kind of that bias of being an American boxing media member, is it right? I'm gonna put Nigel Bennett. Why? Because he beat Gerald McClellan in 1995. Gerald McClellan was in my eyes a great American fighter who was voted I think 27th by the Ring in the top 100 punchers that ever lived pound for pound. Gerald, the G Man, was a bad, bad, bad boy. I heard stories that he used to give it to Tommy Hearns in the Kronk gym in sparring, but he's one of these guys who didn't get the opportunities that Tommy Hearns got. And if he ever fought, Tommy Hearns might have beat him. Kind of like we're talking about Golovkin, if he would have got Cotto, if he would have got Martinez. Anyway, that moment in 1995, that fight is as brutal, in terms of brutality, is as brutal a fight as in the history of boxing. It was the 1995 fight of the year. He fought a Yankee in his backyard. He got knocked through the ropes in the first 90 seconds of the fight. It looked like the fight. He got knocked out of the ring. He climbs through the ropes and unfortunately unleashes such savagery and such a savage fight that Gerald McClellan was never well again. But I think of that moment, in addition to him being a two-division champion, in addition to him having to wait more than a decade, Nigel Benn gets my fourth vote, which leaves me with only one vote left. And I almost want to twist it. Everybody who made their sons fighting such a big deal. And so should my last vote go to Benn and Eubank so they can get in together, or should it go to Triple G? I'm leaning towards it going to Triple G. But I'm going to leave it up to people in the comments. I want their thoughts before I cast this final ballot.
That's a good question. Should Eubank and Benn really... Should that not be a combination question? You should be able to check one box and they both get it. That's a good one. I have to admit, like I was listening, but I had to take a moment because I checked to see if Buster Douglas is in the Hall of Fame.
He's not, right?
He's not, right? He's not, right? But I know he's not because I just checked, but I didn't know. I wasn't sure.
Right.
And so just as an extra wind-up, Buster Douglas defeated Iron Mike Tyson. He was the guy that not only defeated Tyson, for the first person to ever defeat Tyson, the biggest underdog to ever defeat Tyson, a fighter whose defeat of Tyson was never avenged, in a moment that you can't tell the story of boxing without bringing up Buster Douglas. So if that is the criteria, does Buster Douglas not deserve to be in the Hall of Fame?
I think he does. I think specifically now, where it's been a couple decades, because that happens in the NFL. It's like this guy was really good, and he's waited long enough. I think they did this with Drew Pearson of the Cowboys. He won multiple Super Bowls in the 70s with the Dallas Cowboys. He didn't have the numbers of a Jerry Rice, Chris Carter, Michael Irvin, but the man won Super Bowls. His numbers weren't what they were because anyways, he was a guy that they didn't quite think should get in, but after a long enough time and given what he accomplished, they put him in. I think Buster Douglas, that would be fair. And again, that's just my point is I'm leaning towards, and here's the funny part, Raheem. My vote doesn't matter. Golovkin, spoilers, Golovkin is getting in first ballot, okay? So technically my vote really doesn't matter. He's getting in first ballot, and I'm even leaning towards putting him in there. But Chris John's on the ballot. He beat Juan Manuel Marquez. That's a better win than Golovkin ever had. Vernon Forrest beat Sugar Shane Mosley at Madison Square Garden when he was #1 undefeated pound for pound. I'm not going to vote for him right away. Shout out to Pong Salik Wong Jongkam. He was on that pound for pound list for a minute, but I'm not. But I'm leaning towards putting Triple G in, but I at least want to hear what the people got to say.
Yeah, Vernon Forrest is another one I'd like to hear what the people have to say about that. Another great guy. I mean, the way he lost his life, again, tragic, but I think exemplifying a certain kind of character that you'd want to have. Mm-hmm. I look at, because this first ballot thing that you keep saying, does that carry the weight of like a first round draft pick? Like once you're in, you're in. It means something to, I mean, I could say, okay, it means something to maybe when you introduce a guy for a banquet or when you tell people who your father was, you mention that.
First ballot Hall of Famer.
Yeah, I think it means something more to the critics. Really what it means is this person, if they're still with us, get to live more of their life having been in the Hall of Fame, right? So if Buster Douglas still isn't in, but he gets in 5 years from now, it'll be many years since he had that moment that you can't tell the story of boxing without, but you made him wait because that was his only criteria. However, once you're in, is there an asterisk in the Hall of Fame next to your name about which ballot you were on or how many years you had to wait?
Tim Bradley got in. I don't believe Tim was first ballot, and he beat Manny Pacquiao. But he said this, Raheem, to answer your question. Tim said there's tables at the Hall of Fame. And Tim said, I know I don't sit at the Floyd, Sugar Ray Leonard, Muhammad Ali table. I'm in. He's like, but
Yeah.
they're even in the Hall of Fame, there's levels to that.
I look at this shit like the Oscars or like some kind of awards where your peers vote for you, but it depends on the year, depends on, well, does he deserve it now? I mean, I don't know. What did Al Pacino have to wait for seven, nominations, so he's not a first ballot Oscar winner? Like Denzel had to wait for Training Day. You know what I mean? So what are we counting? How many years you didn't get? How many times you were nominated? And how, Meryl Streep, like these things to
You're a
me,
Hall of Famer, right?
they smack the same, right? Like, okay, at some point we got to give it to you because you did that thing. And, whether it's this year, that year, it has a lot to do with politics, money, promotion. And once you're in, you're in. Once you're in, you're in. However, because there's no hard and fast criteria, you can get in for many different reasons, and the bar is all over the fucking place. I hate to always be the contrarian as I'm accused of in the comments, but it doesn't matter that much. I want these people to feel appreciated, to feel acknowledged. I want them to live most of their life, if they've done something that we all carry with us as part of our lives because of what they did, that they should live most of their lives after their careers with that honor. So people have to say that ahead of their name, like MBE or or Sir so and so, or an honorary doctorate from a college you didn't even graduate from. These things are just acknowledgments that you meant something to us. Fine. Am I going to be screaming or crying because this guy got in or that guy didn't, or this was a first ballot and that guy waited 10 years? Yeah, probably not. But boy, I would like for us in boxing to really decide how we decide things.
Yeah. So, okay, ultimately, if you had the ballot, do you cast your vote on Triple G this year?
Yeah, I do. I
Yeah.
absolutely. I told you right out the gate.
Right. Right.
Why? And there's one more question though. There's women on that ballot, and I'm not hearing anybody discuss women getting into the Hall of Fame and how much higher a bar it must be, because we're not even thinking about that. Like, for a woman, I believe, to get into the Hall of Fame on any ballot against a finite number of people you can vote for, and all these men who have had these careers that we're debating, the women are just like, I don't know. Should there be a separate ballot for women? Is
I believe
that
there
wrong?
is.
You know what I
I
mean?
believe there is.
Yeah. So, so you know what I mean? Like, okay, well, what's the bar there then? Where is where is the criteria there? There's a far less fight careers of longevity and iconic moments to draw on in the women's division, just by circumstance of how long it has been a thing and how much money could be made, and the networks and all the reasons that are
Right.
obvious. So where's that bar? Should they not be up against the men? I don't know. I don't know. But in these conversations that I've seen online and even between us, nobody's really debating which woman should go in or who's on the ballot this year. I thought Christina Hammer should go in, right? But if I had to put her up against this list of men, would she be in the conversation? No. But on a ballot of women, sure. These are all questions that make me think some of this stuff is just, really for our own aggrandizement, so that we can have these debates. And let's just keep in perspective that we're really just thanking people, if you will, for their service. Thank you for what you contributed to the sport and the memories that you gave us. But if you don't get in the first ballot, or they make you wait and you think you deserve it, and at some point you do, don't feel like that is diminished your our value for you. There's so many things that go into it that if your name's even on the list, if you're even mentioned in these conversations, if it's a name that we remember and think that people say, oh, it's just an honor to be nominated. In this case, it really is. There's so few warriors that
Hmm.
can do what these people
You're
do.
talking
And
less than 1% of fighters that ever fight, way less than 1% of fighters that ever lace up the gloves, even make it on this ballot. It's an
exactly.
accomplishment in and of itself.
So I want everybody's whose name is on a ballot any year to know it's because we greatly appreciate you. Thank you for what you've done for us in the sport, and just not to feel lesser than or disrespected if you get in this year or not the next year, or you don't get in for 5 years. I don't know that that really carries the weight that we like to believe it does, because nobody can tell me how it happened exactly.
Yeah, just my principle was a lot of great fighters have had to wait a long time. So I don't agree with the sentiment that if you don't think Golovkin needs to get in his first year, you're an imbecile. You don't know anything about boxing. I disagree with that. And also, that's not really the language people use that are confident in their take and don't feel the need to shit on if you feel confident in your take, there's no need to, insult other people who may feel differently. You know who will I will have less hesitation and will immediately put a check by his name when he comes across the ballot because they came together as kind of a trio. Kovalev, Golovkin, and Lomachenko. They sparked this Eastern European takeoff. And Lomachenko, no hesitation there. Why? Because Lomachenko, he accomplished things no other fighter has accomplished. Quickest to a title in 2 divisions, quickest to a title in 3 divisions, got a chance to square off against more big fights than Golovkin in terms of Haney and Lopez and a few others, but Linares at the Garden. And to me, Lomachenko was a little more accomplished than Golovkin, but I'm leaning towards I'm milking it. I just want some engagement in the comments. You guys tell
I
me
hear
what you
what
think. All right, but
I'm
Golovkin's
really
probably going to
looking
get the
forward to
vote.
this comment section.
So
I'm looking forward to this comment section and seeing where people come down on all these issues, like who, because it's gonna, it also is gonna come down to people's favorite boxer, who was the man when they were a kid,
right.
how old they are now, what fights they remember, you know?
Well,
Excuse
look at
me.
my list. The first 3 guys I checked all fought in the 2000s when I fell in love with boxing.
Hey, right. Right,
So
you remember, you have, like, again, the memories, especially those of us who are in the sport, much less those who have a ballot. It's because you're in and around these people, and this is a part of your life as an adult, and probably something you aspired to as a child. So those core memories that you have and who created them are gonna have preferential treatment in your
yep,
mind.
these are things to consider.